Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of EDTalks. It's just so exciting to be here, I can't wait. So, for this very special first episode, we are going to be talking about voting. More specifically, the federal voting age. For those of you who somehow don't know, the current voting age in the US is 18. It used to be 21 up until 1971, but it was lowered with the addition of the 26th Amendment. So this debate is pretty recent. It's not been around a long time. It's been proposed a few times to lower the age to 16. California, Alaska, and Florida all proposed it in the early 2000s, but of course none were successful. But the weird thing about this entire debate is, for something that's so popular among teenagers, the government just pretty much ignores it. That's probably because usually most teenagers spearhead this idea. Their debate comes from a place of being politically mature enough to decide where the US goes in the future. I'm sure there are some 16-year-olds that can do their own research and come to conclusions on their own, but let's just be real. Kids who won't finish their homework on time probably won't have the energy or will to extensively research political candidates. And that doesn't mean all of them. There are some, don't get me wrong. But, being 15, I should know pretty well about the work ethic high schoolers have towards research. And I also know there are a lot of adults who also don't do research, so some think a lack of research isn't a means to restrict 16-year-olds from voting, and that is a perfectly valid argument. But even then, most teenagers don't need to worry about insurance, healthcare, taxes, or other adult-oriented responsibilities. But that still doesn't mean they don't have responsibilities. If both an adult and teenager don't do research on candidates and what their plans are, the adult is always going to be more aware of the outcomes of different plans because they have more responsibilities. For example, it seems odd to let someone vote on tax plans if they don't experience paying them. It's one thing to research what these taxes would mean for different groups of people, but they won't really know them fully until they start paying them. They also wouldn't really be speaking for themselves in any way, shape, or form. They don't pay taxes, so they'd be voting on something that affects their parents more than them. Of course, a system like this would result in parents trying to persuade their teenagers to use their vote to support their party, which is obviously not how a democracy should work. Even though that's what we have going in our country right now, but that's besides the point. I've done a lot of research on taxes. Yes, that's just as lame as it sounds. I'm not old enough to know what tax plans would support my values as an individual, but I am mature enough not to make an uneducated vote based on the perspective of my family. And yes, most 16-year-olds are not mature enough to stop from voting. That's exactly my point. 16-year-olds may be able to do research, but that doesn't mean they will understand these problems fully. Now, I do think it's important to note what would happen if 16-year-olds were allowed to vote. Generation Z is actually one of the most interesting generations the US has ever had. There's an article from the Huffington Post about it called Conservative or Liberal. For Generation Z, it's not that simple. They pulled teenagers from that generation, and they found it was pretty split on whether they were conservative or liberal. The article states that most support same-sex marriage, believe in climate change, and are more liberal in marijuana and transgender issues. So while there may be a split on if the generations are more conservative or liberal, most probably don't agree with most current Republicans. This means the government would probably switch to a Democratic majority, and if not, there would be at least tighter elections. So that's where the opposition comes in. I think it should be pretty clear what would happen to the Republicans if this age was lowered. They obviously want to stay in positions of power, and the newer generation voting would pretty much obliterate their careers instantly. It is important to realize teenagers lacking adult responsibilities shouldn't be voting. But just the same, it's also important to note Republicans are probably more concerned with losing their jobs than immature teenagers voting their way. So, 16-year-olds should not be voting. They definitely could use the 2 extra years before having a say in the direction of government. So hopefully this debate does not carry on for years, because it's like little children whining for attention. These people will not be complaining in 2 years. They will be perfectly fine. And if anything, I'm willing to bet they will look back and agree that they shouldn't have been voting. So thank you everyone for listening to me lampoon a bunch of defenseless kids for 5 minutes. Join me next time, where I'll be talking about something that will make at least some people angry.